Jonathan Haslam's Hubris, The Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. For those familiar with Haslam, or those who have at least heard his name, the expectation in reading this book is probably that it will inevitably blame the US for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That is probably why the book is sometimes alternatively subtitled The American Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. Alternatively, it also sometimes is just simply called The Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. But whatever the title used, Haslam in his summary of events does in fact appear to be critiquing U.S. policy, implying, if not stating, the U.S. caused Russia to invade Ukraine. Here are his main points as follows. The U.S. promised not to expand NATO. Since NATO was historically adverse to Russia, and because they expanded without regard for Putin or Russia's protest, this was seen as a threat. They also did this while disregarding James Baker's personal assurance to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch. The U.S. and NATO, this is the second point, the U.S. and NATO, by defending Bosnians and Kosovars, or alternatively by attacking Serbs, confirmed that the West and NATO were offensive, as opposed to merely defensive and adversarial to Russia's security interest. Number 3, the U.S., by invading Iraq, militarily involving themselves in Syria, and topping Gaddafi, showed that they were willing to act unilaterally or against Russia's interest. Number 4, the efforts to try to include Russia, such as the 1997 Russia-NATO founding document, the Permanent Russian Joint Council, or the Restart program, were severely undermined by the West acknowledging Russia's concerns, then acting contrary to them anyway, in the U.S.'s interest, as opposed to Russia's interest. For example, Putin opposed the U.S. disbanding the Nuclear Ballistic Missile Treaty, yet the U.S. proceeded to violate the past agreement anyway, and they revoked their commitment to this, and essentially gave permission for Russia to do the same, but the point is Putin didn't want to do that. Number 5, the U.S., by intervening diplomatically in Ukraine in the 2004 Orange Revolution and the 2014 Revolution of Dignity against Yanukovych, a pro-Russian ally, showed that the U.S. was willing to intervene in situations contrary to Russia's interest. Number 6, the U.S. did not respect Russia's claim over former Soviet states. Despite itself having military bases around the world, the U.S. didn't respect other countries' right to have military bases around the world, apparently. This is most particularly evident in the 2014 Euromaidan Revolution, where the West undoubtedly took sides with the revolutionaries. This was a disrespect to Russia's sphere of influence. So these are 6 points that Haslam makes in his book that outline why he would blame the West for Russia's invasion of NATO. These are not points I'm making, these are points that he's making. In summary, these are things that alarmed Russia, and therefore the U.S. is responsible for scaring or disregarding Russia to the point where they chose to invade Ukraine. Again, his point, not mine. While Haslam is focused on blaming the U.S. with his comprehensive view of Russia's security interest, sometimes his approach reveals certain counterpoints. If you read beyond his primary assertions, he also presents a clear picture of how Russia provoked the West, and more specifically Ukraine. Here are some examples. He mentioned on page 197 in this edition that the Duma had not ratified the Budapest Memorandum, originally signed in 1994. And on page 257 and 258, he states that this should have been a wake-up call for the West. I agree, it should have been. If this was controversial in Russia, so much so that the Duma would not ratify it, then it should have been a wake-up call that there's something wrong if Russia's not even willing to acknowledge its neighbor's sovereignty. Even when Ukraine was in the political sphere of Russia, they weren't acknowledging its sovereignty to the fullest extent that they could have. Now, of course, they signed the Budapest Memorandum, but the fact that the Duma didn't ratify it does signal something. That should have been an alarm for sovereign nations in Russia's sphere. So other countries that saw themselves within Russia's sphere of influence should have known to move away from Russia at that point. He also mentions on page 167 that Putin commented that Ukraine was an artificial state. He mentioned this referencing the 2008 Bucharest summit, which shows that long before the revolution of Maidan, Putin did not respect Ukraine's sovereignty. So after the revolution, the Orange Revolution, sure, but before the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. So the fact that they had even just one pro-Western president was enough to undermine Putin's view of the country as a sovereign country. Incidentally, he also mentions that the Bucharest summit did not result in a Ukrainian membership action plan. This is true, right? Ukraine did not have the option to join NATO in 2008. This is important since NATO leaders voted against Ukraine becoming a member in order to calm Russia's concerns. It's hard to argue that this summit provoked Russia, especially since this summit, even though the summit said that Ukraine would one day be a member, it was decided at that point they would not give an action plan to Ukraine. And the reason they chose not to give an action plan to Ukraine was because Russia did not want them to. So I believe it was France and Germany, or possibly Italy, that vetoed Ukraine's ascension into NATO at that point. Now, it wasn't likely at that point in time, but the fact is they did not give an action plan. The failed bid for Ukraine to join NATO in 2008 seems somewhat irrelevant given it required Ukraine's consent and the decision was vetoed by Western powers. Meanwhile, Putin's desire for Ukraine to belong to Russia remained consistent despite the fact that there was no action plan for Ukraine to join NATO. Haslam doesn't mention this, but Radek Sikorsky in his 2022 debate with Walt and Mearsheimer mentioned Western leaders gave their personal assurance in early 2022, leading up to the invasion, that they would not let Ukraine join NATO. Macron was one such example, that led to the French preemptively celebrating Macron's peace negotiation. When Macron said he did not believe that Russia was going to invade, and when he told Putin that he wouldn't let Ukraine join NATO, French media reported it as if Macron had already solved the problem. But this proved meaningless not because Russia was afraid of NATO, but because Russia was intent on controlling Ukraine even without a de facto NATO membership. On page 195, Haslam correctly notes that NATO membership was not a popular position in Ukraine when Russia first chose to invade in 2014. Here, Ukraine's bid to join NATO seems not as a provocation to Russia, but a retaliatory move. Haslam doesn't mention this, but Ukraine only removed its constitutional military neutrality 1 year after being invaded, and only formally enshrined its bid for NATO membership to its constitution in 2019. That's 5 years after Crimea, and the Donbas republics that was 5 years after Crimea and the Donbas republics being seized by Russian forces. Despite the fact Haslam doesn't mention this, the fact that he does admit Ukraine was militarily neutral while economically wanting to join the EU does demonstrate that there is more to the situation than simply the US provoking Russia. That is, provoking Russia by attempting to get Ukraine to join NATO. That's not what happened. Instead, it was EU membership, the potential for them to join the EU, that was enough to provoke Russia. And that was with a neutral military. So Russia invaded a neutral country. Haslam is correct in mentioning that the US had ambitions for Ukraine to join NATO, as explicitly stated in the Bucharest summit, and I have no evidence against his claim that this ambition existed since 1991. So Haslam claims that since 1991, the U.S. had wanted Ukraine to join NATO. I think it's kind of nascent at that point, since we all know that the U.S. was probably kind of skeptical of Kuchma or Kravchuk in the early 90s, but still, it was at least on their radar, the potential of Ukraine joining NATO. But when he states such, Haslam uses the same framing that Russian apologists use. Rather than speaking of Ukraine as an independent country that has a right to self-determination and can join whatever alliance it wants, as Russia agreed to it in the 1991 Belovezh Accords. He speaks of Ukraine as though its will is intertwined with whoever puts the most pressure on Ukraine. The question is framed as such: what if the West used Ukraine to provoke Russia with military force the same way the Soviet Empire provoked the West with nuclear rockets in Cuba? This analogy is made by Haslam on page 260, but others like Oliver Stone or John Mearsheimer argue the same point more explicitly, and in my opinion, this misses the mark a bit, since Ukraine actually gave up its nuclear stockpile in order to appease Russia in 1994. And the issue is not so much Ukraine using its military alliance to threaten Russia. Even before 2014, Russia had already had a rather large military base on Crimean soil. But rather the mere political shift away from Moscow was too much for Putin. So it didn't matter that Putin controlled the Sevastopol naval base. What mattered was Ukraine's government was shifting away from Russia's influence. That alone was enough. The 2014 Revolution of Dignity was primarily about removing a corrupt leader who used force and intimidation to silence his opposition. On November 30th, that's exactly what the Yanukovych regime did. They beat protesters and arrested them on false charges. This caused an upstirring. And it also included him arresting his political opposition, Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, there are those who would think Yulia Tymoshenko is guilty because she made a gas deal with Russia. It's the same guilt that could be applied to Yanukovych the same way, as he made gas deals with Russia. So it was selective process trialing. It wasn't a fair trial because it wasn't done in accordance with. It was a clear bias to get his political opposition. Haslam correctly mentions Putin's imperialistic claims to Ukraine at the Bucharest summit, page 167, and his imperial ambitions in his 2021 essay, page 256. But despite such acknowledgments, it would seem fair to assume that Haslam would consider Ukraine as belonging to Russia in the 90s and 2000s, and to the US after the annexation of Crimea. That is, the western part of Ukraine belonged to the West after Ukraine was invaded. Incidentally, by framing the country in these terms, it would seem that Haslam doesn't respect Ukraine's bid to self-determination. Realists, as members of the school of thought call themselves, often seem to frame countries as being not truly sovereign on the basis that they're subject to alliances. This is an impossible burden to resolve, but it's a rather pessimistic view of the situation, I think. And it does demean Ukraine, I think, when you don't recognize their right to choose their own outcome, or you recognize their decisions as merely the decisions of those who may have interest, external interest. As for Haslam's criticism of U.S. policy, these can't really be blamed on Ukraine. His criticisms can't be blamed on Ukraine, like his criticisms of the U.S. Ukraine has no control over whether or not the U.S. wanted to include Ukraine in NATO, which is interesting. It was only Yushchenko who wanted Ukraine to join NATO, but Ukraine collectively had no choice whether or not the U.S. wanted them to join. In 2008, only President Yushchenko really pushed the idea of joining NATO, which is not something that prior to 2014 was really on Ukraine's agenda. But even if Russia were to consider pro-Western factions of Ukraine's government a threat, NATO membership would still require a referendum from the Ukrainian people, which was not politically feasible, since it was such a minority position. Meanwhile, the EU was merely economic, and it can't be said that wanting to join the EU was a military threat to Russia. Again, while Russia had a military base on Ukraine's soil. Ukraine couldn't have taken that if they wanted to. Like most realists, Haslam frames the war as being a battle between great powers and how best to balance these powers. In his framing, America is a naive, accidental bad guy because America's military strength and sphere of influence outweighs that of Russia, and it uses such strength, to lead a retaliation against Russia. This is a futile argument. Power shifts change and are not justifications for an invasion. Comparatively, this is like arguing that Ukraine should invade a small pro-Russian ally like say Serbia or Armenia just to deter Russian expansionism. So if the US should invade, if Russia should invade Ukraine if Russia should invade Ukraine to deter US expansionism, then Ukraine should invade some Russian ally to deter Russian expansionism. It's not a good argument. It's not a good justification. And hypothetical examples could be, say, Serbia or Armenia. Say Ukraine invaded Serbia or Armenia. Would we suddenly argue that this is justified because these are Russian allies? I don't think so. After all, Russia was substantially more powerful than Ukraine in 2014, and they needed to balance the powers. It's like we talk about the balance of powers. Well, you can always make that argument. There's always somebody bigger and more stronger than you. So maybe Russia is not stronger than the US, but Russia, China, and Iran collectively might be. Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, all the countries combined that are considered on that sort of sphere of influence are collectively more strong than the US. Again, then you add NATO and, it's more like this. But, the point is you can always frame these power structures differently. It's not usually a justification for an invasion is all I'm saying. If I am to let my domestic political biases show, this power balance criticism is similar to complaints about the wage gap. Simply because one party has more wealth than another is not necessarily evidence that there was theft or that it was obtained illegitimately. As many Marxist experiments have shown us, equality in wealth is not a realistic objective. I don't believe a balance in powers is any more realistic outside of specific situations, say maybe nuclear deproliferation. In what situation has there ever been a perfect equilibrium in this sphere? There's always been the stronger fish and the weaker fish. In terms of sphere of influence, Russia largely bases its claim on that of the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. But neither of these are analogous to NATO. For a member to join NATO, the country has to vote to join and has to be accepted by every NATO member. The Warsaw Pact had no such liberty. There's a common joke that the Warsaw Pact is the only military alliance to have ever invaded itself, and this is, in fact, how the sphere of influence expanded in the first place. Czechoslovakia was not historically in Russia's sphere of influence. It was closer to Germany. This is why an empire as opposed to union is perhaps a more technical term or a more technically accurate word for what the USSR and the Warsaw Pact actually were. Haslam, on the first page of his preface, acknowledges this imperial heritage of Russia when he says Russia has no history of democracy. However, in legitimizing Russia's sphere of influence as a security concern, he is also legitimizing their imperial claims over other countries. Haslam's point of contention is that the U.S. didn't have to side with protesters during the Revolution of Dignity, nor did they have to send U.S. aid via Brian Fink or set up pro-Maidan TV channels using NED. To be clear, Christopher Stone, in his book, Ukraine's Revolt, Russia's Revenge, denies this claim that Brian Fink was involved in Maidan. But in any case, Haslam seems to suggest that Brian Fink is this person who worked for USAID at the U.S. Embassy and was allegedly involved in Ukraine's revolution. Here the criticism is not only a balance of power, but a perceived overreach in American influence in this former Soviet sphere. It's not simply that the U.S. has more power, it's that the U.S. is walking on Russia's turf, so to speak. But interpreting this as an overreach implies that America was invading Ukraine, as opposed to Ukrainian politicians using American connections to have stronger position on the world stage. Ukrainians have the right to request consultation and political alliance with the U.S. State Department if they so choose. In the same vein, they had the right to request this from Russia, like they did. Yanukovych did this. He requested alliance and consultation from Russia. Sergei Glaziev, I think, is the name of the Russian advisor to Yanukovych. As already mentioned, this was promised to them by Russia in the Belovezh Accords that they would be able to associate freely with whoever they want. But Russia promised Ukraine that it had the right to self-determination. That is what the Belovezh Accords promised them. It's easy to understand why Russia wants Ukraine in its sphere of influence. It's on its border. It's a huge country. It's a big part of its economy. But it's not itself a legitimate argument. It's also not legitimate grounds to say you are being threatened. Haslam's critique of the U.S. are not limited to Ukraine. As already mentioned in my 6 main takeaway points of Haslam's book, he cites specific instances in which the U.S. involved itself in other countries such as Libya, Iraq, Syria, Bosnia, Georgia, and most especially Serbia and Kosovo. With these countries in mind, he presents Russia's perspective, but the issue someone may naturally take with this Russian perspective is that it's narrowly focused. Yes, Serbia was an ally of Russia, and usually allies don't like it when their compatriots get attacked. But what is there to say of the actually say of the justification? Putin may use Kosovo as an analogous justification for his annexation of Crimea, but Kosovo was actively being targeted by Milosevic, if not genocided as reported. This is disputed, but people argue against it, but that was the justification, and the counterclaims have not been proven. It could have very well been a genocide, as far as I know. While Russia may have been correct to assume that Saakashvili in Georgia was invading the breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, for the purpose of joining NATO, it's also possible that Saakashvili was correct when he mentioned that Georgian communities were being targeted by Russians in the occupied regions, and that he was invading in order to keep troops from preemptively invading him. Haslam doesn't give us this kind of background information because he is not concerned with the justifications for non-Russian actors. This is largely because he is trying to understand the Russian mindset, not the Georgian or the Balkan mindset. It also does not matter that Assad or Gaddafi were dictators who tortured their own people. What matters is that they were Russian allies and Russia felt threatened. This is unfortunate. It's not a very good way to view the situation. These points are worth noting, but when looking and considering Ukraine, which is the central question to the book, it's also important to note Eastern Europe's desire to join NATO. Haslam states on page 240 that Poland was hostile to Russia. On page 163 and 164, Haslam describes Poland's Russian policy as though it was motivated out of revenge and irrational hatred of Russia. From this criticism, there are 2 counterpoints to Haslam's thesis that are worth mentioning. The first is that Haslam's main contention was that the U.S. was overreaching itself into the post-Soviet sphere. This is incorrect, since if Poland was hostile on its own terms, it wasn't the U.S. doing this, it was Eastern Europe doing it on its own terms. It was Poland choosing to be defensive against Russia, not the U.S. that was moving in there to invade Russia's sphere of influence. This caricature of Poland as aggressive to Russia for all its faults shows the will of Poland would be for the U.S. to involve itself in Eastern Europe. This is not the U.S. overextending itself, but Eastern Europe inviting the U.S. At least this is the case considering Poland. The second point is that if we use Haslam's realist balance of powers perspective, Poland has a much more substantive reason to fear Russia than Russia has to fear Poland. Russia has more military strength, and Poland has actually been invaded by Russia multiple times. In fact, in addition to its invasion in the Second World War and the Soviet invasion in the 80s, Poland was occupied from the late 18th century to the early 20th century by Russia. How can Russia's security concerns be considered worthy of Haslam's attention while Poland be so readily dismissed? Meanwhile, Poland used to be an empire, so if former imperial territories can rightfully be considered part of a country's spheres, what would be Poland's sphere? While I don't acknowledge this claim to other countries based on spheres, it's considered consistent with Haslam's argumentation. So I don't personally believe that countries have a right to other countries' spheres, or that your sphere justifies what you do, but why would we not say Russia is part of Poland's sphere of influence? And if we're saying an empire has a right to a sphere of influence, Poland used to be an empire, so then Russia should belong to its sphere of influence. It's not a very good argumentation. If Russia's former imperial status gives it claims to Eastern Europe, why does Poland's previous imperial status not give it claims to, say, Belarus? In my opinion, the realist arguments are usually filled with hypocrisy and double standards because there's no real holistic balance of power. While the US and Russia may be avoiding a direct war is very much a reality for smaller countries. Poland's NATO membership definitely changes things, but it doesn't delegitimize their reasons for wanting to join NATO. This is especially true since in the early 90s Russia had occupied parts of Georgia and Moldova, and even had troops in Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine. And they were engaged in war with a region that wanted autonomy, Chechnya. By the rationale presented, it seems other countries had reasons to be wary of Russia. While it was in its most democratic era under Yeltsin, it was also remarkably unstable. These kinds of unstable domestic policies can be concerning since they reveal how administrations are willing to use force against their opponents. This can be said either for Yeltsin, who declared war on the parliament in 1993, or the parliament that allegedly attempted a coup in 1993, or both factions, simultaneously. After all, Yeltsin showed himself willing to overpower his political adversaries, like an autocrat, while his adversaries advocated for a return to communist autocracy. Haslam acknowledges this on page 25 and 26 by quoting Andrei Kozyrev, who was essentially threatening force at a CSCE meeting. This plays largely into reasons for why NATO expansion was justified by Europeans. The decision for NATO to expand eastward was not as easy as Haslam likes to characterize it, nor was it done with hubris, like the title of his book suggests. Much of it might have been seen as desperation given Russia's position, and the memory other former Warsaw Pact countries had of USSR. James Baker's agreement had only political and personal assurances. James Baker could not speak for the NATO alliance, nor could he speak for his predecessor's administration. Similarly, Gorbachev almost certainly didn't speak for Poland or states that had not yet declared independence. But whatever the assumption about Baker and Gorbachev's agreement was, Russia did promise the former Soviet countries the right to self-determination. At times in the book, Haslam seems to be arguing two things at once. The first is that Russia was a threat, and the U.S. should have took it seriously when it mentioned its security concerns, and also that Russia was provoked by American hubris. This second concern seems to imply that it would have been better to not expand NATO and leave Russia alone. Let it regain autocracy and strength on its own. When he argues that there were warning signs, he does not seem to be arguing that Russia was benevolent, but that violating its interest was a security risk for the West. Traditionally, the way you deal with a security threat is you disable it, which would contrarily support the American and Polish approach to NATO containing Russia. If provoking Russia was a risk, so was ignoring Russian aggression a risk. Incidentally, most of the book seems to be advocating for a less involved, less hard-lined position from the U.S., where they could have demonstrated flexibility in the face of Russian aggression. Yet on page 251, he also explicitly says that Germany and Merkel's attempt at appeasing Putin was the wrong approach. So at the end of this, I'm very confused as to what is Haslam's position. Now, it's perfectly possible I am misunderstanding what Haslam is attempting to do. Not all political scientists write with morality in mind, nor do they necessarily advocate for one strategic approach over another. Some just merely attempt to describe things. But in my reading of the text, Haslam does seem to be suggesting two paradoxical things. By calling Poland's approach of containment hostile, and Angela Merkel of Germany's approach of appeasement almost certainly, quote, almost certainly the wrong way of going about it, page 251, it does seem as though it doesn't seem like he's actually offering any answers. So if Germany's too lenient and if Germany's too lenient and Poland is too aggressive, what is the answer here? Because Russia was so clear in its demand that NATO not expand, and because Russia objected to the U.S. leaving former Soviet agreements behind after the end of the Cold War, Haslam states that the fall lies with the U.S. He says this on page 258. Yet, when we actually look at NATO expansion, it was rulers like Merkel who curtailed the U.S.'s attempt at NATO expansion by vetoing Ukraine. So, which approach is correct? For all this writing, Haslam doesn't seem to actually know, but wishes to focus on the collective failure among Western officials. Poland is too aggressively involved with prejudice against Russia. The U.S. is too distant and indifferent to the warnings Russia transmitted. And Germany was too willing to appease and give Russia what it wanted. Is it perhaps an argument for a mean between these extremes? If so, the mean is not clear. What is the mean that he is suggesting? I'm not a political scientist, nor am I even necessarily a particularly good reader. But if I misrepresented Haslam, or if you can make sense of my confusion, please let me know in the comments. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. There are many better videos than this, but I appreciate you listening. Thank you. That is my review of Haslam's Hubris, the origins of Russia's war against Ukraine.